All right, what if I told you that the blueprint for modern power wasn't designed in a boardroom, but was actually carved in stone thousands of years ago? Well, today we're diving into a really fascinating theory that argues exactly that the whole structure of our world can be found in a very, very old story. So let's just jump right in with a pretty provocative question. Is Pharaoh still in charge? And obviously, I don't mean a literal king in Egypt. I mean the idea of Pharaoh. You know, that ancient top-down structure of absolute power. The source material we're exploring today puts forward this really compelling and, yeah, maybe a little controversial idea that the power struggle in the biblical story of the Exodus gives us a surprisingly sharp lens to understand the power structures we're all living in right now. So, an ancient lens today, we're going to use this story as what you might call an analytical archetype, basically a framework to see if these old patterns of power are just repeating themselves with a modern coat of paint. Now, just so we're all on the same page, this isn't a history lesson or a theology deep dive. We're really just using this ancient story as a critical tool, a model to try and deconstruct our world. And to do that, we first have to get a handle on the original structure of that power. So let's talk about Pharaoh's pyramid of power, the original blueprint. We're going to break down how this whole ancient power structure actually worked according to the narrative. The structure it describes is actually pretty simple. At the very top, the apex, you have Pharaoh, the absolute authority, basically seen as a living god. Then in the middle, you've got the magicians and priests. They're the illusionists. Their whole job is to legitimize Pharaoh's rule through spectacle and ideology. And then, holding it all up at the base, you have the enslaved population, whose forced labor fuels the entire system. And the power at the top was, well, total. The analysis we're looking at describes Pharaoh as a false god, which means his authority wasn't just political. It was presented as theological, as divine, and as something you just couldn't question. And this brings us right to the heart of this whole explainer. Does this ancient structure have a modern equivalent? The theory we're examining argues pretty emphatically that yes, it does. So take a look at this direct comparison. The theory maps its ancient pyramid directly onto our world today. Pharaoh becomes a group of transnational elites. The magicians and priests, they become the modern illusionists. And the enslaved Hebrews are transformed into what the text calls an instrumentalized populace. So let's actually break down what each of these modern tiers mean. Okay, let's start at the very top of this proposed modern pyramid, a new kind of divine oligarchy. So who is this new pharaoh? Well, according to this analysis, it's not a single person. It's more like a whole network of transnational corporate, financial, and political elites. And their divine commands? They're ideas presented as unquestionable truths, things like the market always knows best or that the endless accumulation of capital is our ultimate purpose. These ideas are pushed as just natural and inevitable, almost like the will of a god. So how do you support a structure that massive? Well, right below the apex, we find the modern illusionists, today's version of Pharaoh's magicians. And this group is, well, it's vast. The theory points a finger at corporate media that shapes what we see, PR industries that spin whatever narrative is needed, and even the algorithms on social media that curate our reality. It also includes the policymakers, lobbyists, and elite academic institutions, the ones creating the theories and laws that make the power at the top seem totally legitimate. Their role is to make the system seem fair, necessary, and like there's no other way. And that brings us to the foundation of the pyramid, the base that everything else rests on, the instrumentalized population. Now, this is a really crucial point. The theory isn't talking about literal chattel slavery. It's describing a systemic kind of control, one that's achieved through things like wage dependency and spiraling debt, which kind of create a form of modern serfdom. It's also driven by a consumerist ideology that tells us what to want, and the text even argues it's what allows populations to be mobilized for endless wars. But the analysis doesn't just stop there with a simple story of good guys and bad guys. It introduces a much more complex and, frankly, challenging idea it calls the problem of innocence. To really get this point across, the source goes back to the original story. It notes that even the enslaved Hebrews weren't always cheering for escape. They actually talked about a fear of liberation, sometimes even wishing for the grim but predictable life of servitude over the scary uncertainty of freedom. And this leads to a really, really tough question. Can someone be both a victim of a system and, in some way, be complicit in keeping that very same system going? The theory actually gives this a name: systemic guilt. It's this difficult idea that just by participating in the system, going to work, paying our bills, we might be, however unintentionally, reinforcing the whole structure. It throws out the simple idea of innocent versus guilty and suggests we're all kind of tangled up in it together. So if that's the diagnosis of the problem, what's the proposed solution? Well, the analysis wraps up by calling for a modern exodus, and it frames it as a kind of prophetic imperative. The path forward, according to this framework, has 4 pretty clear steps. First, just recognize that this pyramid structure exists. Second, identify the modern false gods, those core ideologies that drive the whole system. Third, demystify the work of the illusionists, pull back the curtain on how they make it all seem normal. And finally, number 4, consciously reject the complicity that comes with servitude. And this really gets to the ultimate takeaway from the source material. It argues that resisting this system isn't just about politics or economics. It's framed as something deeper, a moral, even spiritual obligation, a theological, ethical mandate for systemic resistance. So we end up right back where we started, with a question that brings this whole theory home. If this pyramid is real, what does a collective exodus actually look like in the 21st century? That's definitely something to think about.